Hello. Welcome to North Country History with Rob Berg. I'm Rob, and I will be your guide in exploring the forest history of the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes may have been the center of the North American lumber industry in the late 19th century, but it was only after logging moved west as the northeastern forests were depleted. The first lumbermen who came to Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota did not just appear out of nowhere in the forest. They were experienced lumbermen and loggers coming from places like Pennsylvania, New York, Maine, New Brunswick, Canada, and Quebec. The Bangor Tigers, the well-known lumbermen coming from the North Woods of Maine, were some of the most successful loggers who swung an axe in the 1700s and the early to mid 1800s. In today's episode and the following two after this one, we will explore some of the lumber industry in the Northeast. Today's episode focuses on the birth of the North American lumber industry in the 17th and 18th century in Maine, which would be the first leading center of lumber on the continent. So settle in, sit back, and enjoy the show. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. Hello. Logging and the state of Maine go hand in hand. It was their biggest industry for 200 years, you could say. I mean, if you were on the coast of Maine, and many people go to Maine now to visit the coast, you think of the ocean and fishing. But Maine is a vast state. I mean, it's very, for the East, it is huge. It's one of the largest states in the eastern United States, and it's mostly forested. And it was the trees in Maine that attracted people to first settle in Maine in the beginning of the 1600s, even earlier than what the settlement in Plymouth. It was people attempted to settle in Maine about the same time as Jamestown was launching. And I say attempted to settle in Maine because their first attempt at a colony failed. It was the pines that attracted people there, and in 1607, the first colony, known as the Popham Colony, was attempted around the mouth of the Kennebec River. I don't have a map of Maine to show you on air, but it's kind of the southwestern part of the state. There are a number of rivers that flow or that are in Maine that were great for lumber. The Kennebec, the Androscoggin, and most notably the Penobscot River. The rivers flow from the deep interior of Maine, and they have large navigable areas, I should say, to where you could get ships up into them quite a ways. And it made it just perfect for the logging and the shipping of that lumber. And I'm getting ahead of myself, so let me jump back to the beginning. The Maine was first attempted to be colonized by a kind of a company. Many of the colonies were first formed by companies of investors. And one of the most notable ones with the Maine colony, or the company there, was Sir Sir Ferdinando Gorges. He's English, but he certainly had a non-English first name. And he saw the amount of lumber, and he didn't see it himself personally, but through reports, the pines, that this would be very necessary for the British Empire and the Royal Navy specifically. During the 1600s, as the Royal Navy was beginning to become the most powerful navy on the oceans, they were in great need of a lot of naval supplies, material for building their ships. Great Britain lacked much of that, particularly the trees for the lumber to build these wooden vessels, and especially the masts, the what held up the sails, the large poles there when you look at a sailing ship. That was very, very important because without those, you don't have the sails, you can't propel your ship. And many of them that they were getting were coming from the Baltic Sea, around Sweden, Denmark, Finland, or Finland was not a nation, Russia. That was where they were getting a lot of these spruce that were being used to build the masts. In the mid 1600s, a war with the Netherlands, the Dutch Navy closed the Baltic Sea to the British, and they had to look elsewhere. And this is where the mast production in the colonies in what would become the United States began to play a role using the eastern white pine. And I spoke about this in an earlier episode in season 1, in the second episode about the eastern white pine and the importance of the masts that would lead to a lot of discourse in the colonies, particularly New Hampshire and Maine. Maine not being a colony per se, it was part of the Massachusetts colony at that point, and would be until it became a state in 1820, was part of Massachusetts. But that led to a lot of discourse here in the colonies, as I mentioned. And it was it was not the tobacco, it was not cotton, which would come much later in the South, but it was a lumber that was very important in the American colonies, and Maine would be one of the central areas for that. The first settlements in the successful settlements in Maine would happen in the a little bit later than the 1607, 1608, when the first colony, the Popham colony, was attempted and then failed, partly due to the climate. It was very extreme. Many people did not want to stay. And then their leadership dissolved. George Popham, the original governor of the colony, died, and his second in command, who took over, stayed, but shortly thereafter he returned to England when he inherited land there that he chose to stay there instead of in Maine. So that kind of died on its own because of that. But Ferdinando, got it right that time, Ferdinando Gorges kept his claim there and supported people moving into Maine and providing lumber, shipping it back. And so some small communities slowly began. And in 1634, in the community of Berwick, Maine, which was on the Piscataqua River just upstream of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, was where the first sawmill was founded was first built in Maine. So you're looking at just 14 years after the Plymouth colony, Maine has its first now sawmill there for the cutting of lumber. Prior to that, they were using what's called pit saws, and they were either built over a pit or on a scaffold. You'd put a log on there, and you'd have one man up on top with a crosscut saw handle and one man down below. And of course, the man down below was getting all the sawdust coming down into his eyes, and not fun to do that at all. You can actually see a demonstration of that here in Michigan if you visit Historic Mill Creek up outside of Mackinac City, operated by the Mackinac State Historic Parks. They also have a water-powered sawmill that you can see then the difference between the two. And but that type of sawmill, the water-powered one, is what was built in Berwick, and there were soon after many in Maine. And by the mid-1600s, there were around 50 sawmills located throughout Maine, now cutting timber that was initially being used for local use, for construction, then also sending planks to other areas in the American colonies, and also back across to England there. But with the closure of the Baltic Sea to the Royal Navy, they finally looked across the sea to look at the white pine and being used for mast. So the mast industry really did fuel the lumber industry in Maine and in New England. However, it was very expensive to send those masts back across to England there, and it was always a little bit difficult for them with the logging of it, with these large, 150-foot plus trees as they're coming down, to not have them shatter, because if they shattered, when they hit the ground, they would become useless. You might be able to get some smaller logs out of there for other uses, but as a mast, it was wasted. So you couldn't cut, or not every one that came down would end up as a mast, and that was also very kind of a risk that you took in this industry. And then having ships that were big enough to be able to hold those masts in their hulls. They had gates, or hatches into the hull there that you could open up, load them in there, and then they'd seal them back up to try to keep them as watertight as possible, because you certainly don't want the ship to sink as it's going back across the Atlantic. And there were then shipbuilding industries developed here in in the American colonies, to where they could then just build the ships right there. I don't know when the first shipbuilding facilities began in Maine itself, but in the growing towns along the coast, the Atlantic coast there, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Newburyport, Massachusetts, and elsewhere, certainly developed into shipbuilding centers that were used by the British along with the American colonists themselves. So they went hand in hand, the lumber industry in Maine and the maritime industry. And when you visit Maine today, those are the two things that you really want to see, if possible. I did get a chance to visit Maine in October, which was partly why I am doing this episode of what I saw, and I know I wanted to share it with everybody. And to be able to spend time to do everything you want, you really need to take a couple of weeks vacation. I had 1 week, and my time in Maine was only just a few days, because I did drive out from Michigan. I hit Pennsylvania and New York, and as I mentioned, there'll be episodes on those here coming up very soon, and through the Vermont and New Hampshire and then to Maine. So certainly did not have enough time to spend, but driving along the coast, visiting Acadia National Park, I got a taste of the maritime history of Maine, and then getting up to Bangor, and also then to Bradley, Maine, two places that have played a little bit part in the Maine lumber industry as well. But so the early part of the Maine industry, or the lumber industry in Maine, was in the 1600s, the beginning of the mast trade, and that continued into the 1700s. And they had the masts, and they reserved, the Royal Navy did, of any white pine that was 24 inches in diameter or greater. And that was at ground height, where it came up out of the ground. And so these were not necessarily the big behemoths that we look at, that we talk about today, 4 foot, 6 foot diameter trees, but 2 foot diameters, excuse me. And but they were certainly trees that were, tall, slender, would be good for use for hanging sails on. But those were valuable trees. If you were a landowner and you had those trees on your land, you could cut those, you could sell them, and make a fair amount of money. But with the Mast Act in 1729, they reserved all of those for the Royal Navy, including ones that were on private land as well, not just the crown land or the king's land, but on any land. And this led to quite a protest here in the American colonies in New England. And it was sometimes it led to violence, as mentioned in the about the White Pine or the riots in New Hampshire in the early 1770s that some say led to the Boston Tea Party, and then of course on the road to revolution. But in Maine, it got very difficult about the time of the 1730 or so, when a gentleman by the name of David Dunbar, he was a colonel for the British Army, and he was appointed the Surveyor General of the King's Woods for the District of Maine. And wow, he was such a I don't want to swear on this show, so he was a jerk, and he was greedy, and he found a way that he thought he could take some of this land basically for his own, create his own colony in kind of the central part of the Maine coast, and set himself up as the governor, because he saw that some of this land in the early 17 or just prior to this time had fallen into possession of the French during one of the many colonial wars or many wars between France and England, and they certainly spilled over into war in North America. In the wars with France and the British and the French here, the most famous is the French and Indian War of the 1750s, which which Britain then captured Canada from the French, and Canada became, a British colony. Prior to that, it was French. But at one point, the French had taken part of Maine and incorporated into their Acadia colony that was mostly based in what's now New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, Canada. And they spread down the coast there. And so they that area then was claimed by France for quite a while. And later it then returned back to British hands. And Dunbar thought that because this land had once been part of this private company, where it could not be touched then by the British government, but then it was captured again, won by the British government, by the Army and the Navy and the provincial troops out of Massachusetts. So then that meant it was now up for grabs. It was part of the British property, not the private company. So he then was able to get some supporters in London to back him on this and appoint him as the governor of this new colony. And this just led to a huge outcry. And because this was part of the Massachusetts province, Maine had been incorporated into Massachusetts by this time, that he had too many enemies, and he was ousted eventually, but it led to even more opposition to the Mast Act. And that would continue to be an issue for the next 40 years, you could really say, up until 45 years, until the start of the American Revolution, the War of Independence. And the pine was certainly one of the greatest, causes in at least that part of New England, where they were quite upset with the British kind of heavy-handedness of treating them with what was their most lucrative commodity, was the lumber. It wasn't tobacco, it wasn't gold, which was hoped for, where Spain, their colonies down in Latin America, were discovering gold. There was very little gold found along the North American colonies, the English colonies. There was fur. That was, one of the important ones. But of course, as I have referred to it in the past, lumber became the green gold, the pine, and that was what was lucrative. Fish was also very important, and That's why up in Newfoundland, which became a British colony, not part of Canada, actually not until the 1940s, did Newfoundland become incorporated into the nation of Canada. It was an independent colony or dominion of the British Empire for a period of time. But all of that was very important up here. Fishing, lumber, fishing going back into the maritime trade. That was what made the northeastern part of North America. It wasn't tobacco. It wasn't gold. It wasn't rice or indigo, as in the Carolina colonies, or cotton that would come later. But it was these other ones. And so all of these were formed by various ways, and this one directly was lumber. And lumber stayed king in Maine. Maine did become a state in 1820. It was separated from Massachusetts at that point. And during this time, the lumber industry became very important. If you visit Maine and you go to Bangor, it's on the Penobscot River, but it's quite a ways upriver from the Atlantic Ocean, and it has a large estuary, and tidal flow goes up there quite a ways. But Bangor, as far up as it is, was the main port on the Penobscot River, and it was where the lumber came to. A lot of mills in the area there. And I have some information here. It's not, of course, all on one page, but by 1832, Bangor had become the largest shipping port for lumber in the world. And this comes from the MaineHighlands.com and an article on that website called Lumbering in Maine. At its peak, as many as 3,000 ships were anchored in Bangor, creating a bustling scene where one could almost walk across ship's decks to Brewer. Brewer was a smaller community across the river from Bangor. Between 1832 and 1888, an astounding 8,737,628,202 board feet of lumber were shipped from Bangor. And Bangor was definitely the lumber capital of the world at that point. It would be replaced by Saginaw, Michigan, eventually, when Michigan lumber developed around during the same time period. And the milling in Maine, mostly on the Penobscot, were located kind of right there around where Bangor is, and Brewer across the river, Bradley just upriver a little bit, along with Old Town and Orono. Those became the large lumber areas of Maine. But the Penobscot River reaches far up into deep into the Maine highlands, the interior area there. And I say highlands because this area is mountainous. This is where the Appalachian Mountains, move up through from the south and goes up through into New England and into Canada as well. And so, I mean, it's not as high as some areas further south, like along in the Blue Ridge and the Alleghenies in the central part of the Appalachians there in Tennessee and North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, and that region. But these are still very high areas, and lumbering up in there, it was difficult to get the logs out, and of course getting it to the rivers. This is why lumber in that area lasted so much longer than it did in Michigan, because it was more difficult to get the lumber out. Plus, you're using technology that was much slower to advance than what happened in Michigan when our boom took place in the 1800s and coincided with a lot more industrialization. But the town of Patten, Maine, located about 100 miles upriver from Bangor, that became a major center of camps, of a lot of logging operations through there. And I didn't get a chance to get up there, but there's a great museum in Patton called the Maine Lumbering Museum. And when I worked at Hartwick Pines, we were able to get some information from Patton, Maine, from their lumbering museum for our programming. In fact, our recipe for beanhole beans came directly from them. And that's baked beans baked in a pot in a hole in the ground. And they would cook overnight, being cooked by hot rocks from that captured the heat from a fire that was built on top of them in the hole. And then when the fire burns out, you put the pot down in there and bury it in sand and let it cook. The earth and the rocks holding in the heat there and cooking the pot of beans. Quite an experience, and that's how they would feed their men. And with the Maine logging, that translated into Michigan as well. And the lumbermen came to Michigan, to the Great Lakes. They brought a lot of their practices with them, and a lot of terms came from the Maine logging from that period here to Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota. The state of Maine camps, the type of camp they used, which was one large building, men sleeping on one side, and then the meals being cooked and served on the other side, with a large fire in between, a raised fireplace called a camboose, and then with an opening up in the rooftop overhead to allow the smoke to come out. And it was a chimney, but you had basically it was an open space between the fire and then the chimney up in the roof, and it could be a very smoky building, unhealthy air, I suspect, in there. But it was small camps usually at that time, 20, 30, 40 men at the most, not to what it would grow to 100 or more men in the Great Lakes logging camps. You had as I mentioned, the camboose was the fireplace there. Basically a 10 by 12 or so raised hearth filled with sand, and then open fires on top of that. You had the van or the wanigan that was started out as a storage area in the camp, usually used for the office. But then it developed into being the term for the rafts flowing down or following the lumber drives flowing down the rivers. So all of these various terms there. But one particular introduction from Maine really was important for all of lumber here in the United States, in Canada, the world. And that was the contribution of one man by the name of Joseph Peavy. And where do I find my Peavy information? Bear with me here while I get that. Okay. Okay, here we go. And the peavy is a traditional logging tool used primarily to handle, move, and roll logs. And it was a pole that was used for the most part in the river drives. And it was invented by blacksmith Joseph Peavy in 1858 in Stillwater, Maine. And it became an essential tool in the logging industry. I'm reading again from Lumbering in Maine, the article from themainehighlands.com. And when I learned this, when I was working at Hartwick Pines, I was always told that Joseph Peavy was a blacksmith in Bangor, and he saw these men working on the river drives and trying to handle their tools and having difficulty. He was watching from a bridge going across the Penobscot River. Well, that turns out to be true, but he was further upriver in Stillwater, probably about 10 miles as the crow flies, a little bit further river-wise, upriver from Bangor. But it's so the story of it is that it was the spring of 1857 that Joseph Peavy made his first tool to become known as the Peavy. And this is here now coming from the Peavy Manufacturing Company history. a different website, pvmfg.com. And it was in Stillwater, Maine, in the heart of the booming logging industry. One day, a log drive became hung up on the Stillwater branch of the famous Penobscot River. Joseph Peavy, he lay flat on a bridge overhead, watching the men with their improvised prize trying to free the jam. Seeing the unsteadiness of the prize and realizing they needed something different, the idea came to him that he could make a better tool. As the story goes, he jumped up, went back to his blacksmith shop, and directed his son Daniel to make a clasp with lips, then make holes in the lips to put a bolt through on which to hang a dog or hook, and toe rings below the clasp at the bottom of the handle. Finally, a pick was driven into the end of the handle, and the tool was turned over to river driver William Hale, who pronounced it a great success. So what it is, it's a pole, a wooden pole, about 6 foot long handle, and there's about 18 inches down from the bottom of or from the top of the pole is a clasp with a hook on there, and it can swing because it's kind of put through the bolt there, allows it to swing back and forth, and where it swings up the hook, and it has a point on there that will grip into the log, but up at the top where it swings up is this pike that was jammed into it, and that had a nice sharp point on there, and that could be used to jab logs, to push them, and you can use then the hook there to kind of grab and pull the logs either on the water or on land. So it was very handy. It was kind of two tools in one. A cant hook, which is one that had the hook but did not have the point on it, the pick, and then also a jam pole or a pike pole that had the pick on the end of it. So these were kind of combination tools that he created there. And this was 1858. It was well into lumbering in Maine, of course, having started in the 1600s. And it had begun in the Great Lakes region prior to this time. So it was a late introduction, but it helped to revolutionize lumber, and they're still in use today. And the Peavy Company still manufactures these, and they own the patent on there, and then others have produced them. They have to pay royalties for the production of them. And it's just a tool that you can still find to this day. There's been some adaptations of it, but it's still a successful tool used in lumbering. And that was invented there in Maine by Joseph Peavy in 1858 in Stillwater. And as I mentioned, Maine has all of this rich lumber history. And in my time in Maine, I didn't get a good chance to visit too much of it. But what I did get to see was the Maine Forest and Logging Museum, which is located in Bradley, Maine, across the river and just up a few miles from Penobscot, probably not more than about 8 miles upriver. And it's a nice site. And it's not right on the Penobscot River. It's in the interior a little bit, but it's on the site of an old settlement by the name of Leonard's Mills. And Leonard's Mills was originally established by Oliver Leonard in the 1780s, and it was a sawmill site. It was on a small creek, originally known as Nichols Stream, and it was a water-powered sawmill that Oliver Leonard built, and to power the saw that was on the interior. Now, when I visited the site in October, it was closed. I mean, the buildings were all closed. They're only open actually when they have special events in there, but you can walk around the site, and which is what I did. And but they recreated starting in the 1960s. They started to recreate the site, buildings there on where the original foundations were, and near, some of them were buildings that were built, kind of recreations on their own. But they chose this community, this Leonard's Mill community, that was in operation from the 1780s up into the early 1800s. of that kind of pre-industrial lumber town. Very different from what you saw in the Great Lakes region, where yes, some of the early mills here were water powered, but they were quickly changed over to steam powered mills that you would see that would power the big lumber boom in the Great Lakes region. But this was a neat site to walk around, and you could see, it was a small settlement. The men who worked there lived right there. You had the miller's house. He would be the most important person in the community, and that would have been Oliver Leonard at first. And because he was the one who operated the mill, owned it, and you had the different workers there, the workshops to, the blacksmith shop and the saw sharpening would have been taking place in there. But because they were on the water there, you had there was a dam, so they could create the spillway to power the water wheel. It was all just very interesting, and I would love to have been able to be there during one of their events to have seen it in operation. But not being able to do that, I'm going to make sure that in August, when I go on vacation up through northern Michigan and out into Wisconsin and Minnesota, I'm going to make a stop at Mill Creek, historic Mill Creek, as I mentioned, and see their water-powered sawmill in operation once again. It's been many years since I've seen that running, and it'll be very cool to see it once again. But so if you visit Maine, try to put on your list of places to go is the Maine Forest and Logging Museum in Bradley. Oh, and adjacent to that is the University of Maine's forest that they have for their forestry program. They're located in Orono. That's just across the Penobscot River from Bradley. And but the gate for the forest was because it's a road that goes back in there, was open, so I had a chance to drive back in there. And yes, this is all areas that had been logged off, so there are no old growth white pine or other trees back in there, but it's a scientific managed forest, and it's to teach new forestry students, modern foresters, the science of forestry. So there is no interpretive information to show what you're seeing, but they had signs out there and showing different plantations that they were growing, and I didn't know exactly what each was, but I've worked with foresters, so I did have a little bit of an understanding of showing the different successions, the stages of the forest. But if that's open, if you visit out there, that certainly is a neat thing to do. But I didn't want to go too far back because I was afraid the gate might be locked on me. It was the end of the day, and I had seen a couple of University of Maine vans with students in them driving back and forth. So I thought, well, somebody's going to come back after they know the last van load of students are gone and lock that gate up. And I really didn't want to spend the night in the Maine woods. As much as it would have been cool to do, all my stuff that I needed were in my back at my hotel. So I wasn't prepared for that at that point. So, you can only be an adventurer for so long and so far. But so that's definitely one place to get to. And another one is in Patton itself and at the museum there. And as I said, I didn't have time to get up to that, but that's definitely something that would be worthwhile. Now, the Maine lumber industry did end about the 1880s. And we're not going into too much depth of their whole industry there. This was more of the birth of the industry this week. But as over the years, they were supplanted first by Pennsylvania as the leader. And we'll get into Pennsylvania logging here in a couple of weeks in an episode. And because they had large rivers to move the lumber, the Susquehanna River, the Allegheny River, and that reached into large interior areas. And that also was when circular saws, steam-powered sawmills were starting to be used. And then that only led the industry for a short period when Michigan took over And as I mentioned in previous episodes of the first season, with the water power or the steam power mills and the amount of water we had, rivers, and of course with the Great Lakes. So Maine, though, was what led it initially. And so many people from Maine came and they migrated to Pennsylvania. They migrated to Michigan, to Wisconsin, to Minnesota. A lot of your early lumbermen, those who ran owned the camps, owned the companies, they came from Maine, or also New Brunswick, Canada. That was very much the same time period as the Maine logging. And then a lot of the lumberjacks, the shanty boys, they followed too. And I mentioned at the beginning of the episode the famous Bangor Tigers. If you were a Maine logger in Michigan in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, you were royalty because you were an expert lumberman with a lot of new loggers here in Michigan, men that had never done the job before, coming from farms or emigrating from other countries. Maine loggers, they were the royalty, along with French Canadians coming from Quebec, coming from New Brunswick. So Maine definitely left its mark on the world in the lumber industry. And thankfully, we were able to talk about that a little bit today and just get a taste of, where the lumber industry in Michigan and the Great Lakes came from. So as always, I hope that you enjoyed the show. And if you liked it, please subscribe. That's a new option that we have now to support the show. And but as always, if you enjoyed it, tell a friend. Let's get the word of mouth out there. Try to spread this as much as possible. The podcast is slowly growing. I'm very pleased with the growth we had in the first season. And now going into the second season here, we're just hopefully it continues to grow bigger. And you can follow along here, not only on the podcast website, but anywhere where you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio. Those are three of our biggest ones here for the podcast. I'm also on my own YouTube channel, North Country History, and also on Facebook, Rob Berg, Environmental Historian. So please follow along, share it with others. And next week, we'll be talking about lumber and logging in the Adirondack Mountains in New York. And we'll continue on our exploration of the early logging in the Northeast. Thanks for listening, and I'll be talking to you again. Bye. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.